I am Dr. William Brozo from George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, which is just outside of Washington, D.C. And I've been a professor there for 12 years. But I've been a professor in higher education at several different universities in the United States for 35 years. So I'm quite an experienced professor. My area of expertise in the area I teach is in literacy. We use this broad term literacy, but it's primarily reading and writing literacy. And I work in the Graduate School of Education, so I'm working primarily with teachers who are earning master's degrees and doctoral students who would like to get a PhD in literacy or a cognate in literacy from another major. And they pursue positions in higher education or in think tanks, in NGOs, in government. So they do a number of things.
Yeah, so thank you very much for being here, Bill. It's an honor for me, and yeah, I'm really happy that you're here because you're such an expert on reading. And if you don't mind, I would like to ask you a few questions on reading.
Of course, yeah.
And I mean, we are particularly interested how we can support struggling readers. Obviously, that's a big factor for many teachers. And children who struggle with reading often turn into adolescents with reading problems. And what can be done to prevent these students from having lifelong problems with reading?
Yeah, and isn't it a pity that we know this? Statistics continue to show that this is true, and yet we continue to struggle to really make a difference with enough children so that we can somehow get them back on track and get them to be, competent, good readers. Well, look, I mean, we all know that some programs have been successful, but they typically aren't successful for everyone. So it really does take, I think, a village to make a difference in the lives of these young people, which means everyone who has an interest and stake in the improvement and literate health of kids and youth should be involved, So let's start with school. I think the first thing we need to be doing at school is a better job of diagnosis. We need to find out on a number of levels, cognitively, affectively, sociologically, where these kids are so that we can put together programs and instructional packages that are responsive to the needs that are evidenced on these diagnoses. And then that's where everyone needs to put a common shoulder to the wheel, because I think too often what happens at that point is just the special teacher. In America, for instance, we have remedial reading teachers or learning disabilities teachers who are primarily responsible for these students who are who are struggling with reading or learning. I think every teacher needs to be involved in trying to make a difference in the literate future of these young people. Consequently, not only those special teachers, but the regular teacher from all of the courses that a student might be going to throughout the day or throughout a typical school day. Librarians need to be involved so that they can put programs together to create incentives for reading. And then when we broaden beyond the school setting, we need to be thinking about community members and their potential impact they can have. And again, public libraries and the kinds of programs that might be available through public libraries. And finally, and probably first and foremost, we need to be doing more with parents to make sure that parents and other family members who can have a positive influence on the literacy development of these young people do all they can to make a difference. Now, you and I know this, that many parents have attitudes that are positive about helping their children learn and read and so on, but they don't have the skills to do it. Yeah. So we need programs that bring parents and older family members into this community that can help develop and nurture a love of reading, a habit of reading, the skills of reading for their children. So those are some of the ways in general I think we need to be addressing the concern.
Yeah, I mean, you have mentioned quite a few people now who should be involved in that, but who's responsible at school for the literacy development of children and youth?
I think everyone, as I just said, and I think for me, this is especially a concern at the lower and upper secondary levels, because too often, students are being routed through one subject after another. The professors in those courses typically see themselves as lecturers and not necessarily as support staff, right? And consequently, if a student has any encounters or experiences at all with support, it once again, it comes from whoever is the special teacher, the learning disabilities or special ed teacher, or if you have in the German context a remedial reading or reading support person. But it needs to be happening in every single course. So a science teacher needs to scaffold good reading practices for all students, and that includes those who are struggling in his or her classroom. The math teacher needs to be doing whatever he or she can do to try to support the reading development and so on of students. The social studies and history teachers need to be doing something. So in saying that, we have the next big concern, and that is what kinds of professional development do these teachers receive in order to develop the skills and competencies and toolkit, if you will, for dealing with students who may be struggling to read in their courses. And that's a very important question, because we can't simply tell them to do it. I think we need to give them the tools to do it well and to be successful. So a concern that I've had for years, and I've developed books around this topic and so on, and lots of research, is this idea of content area literacy or content area reading.
What does that mean?
Yeah, so it means that let's take a subject area like science, for instance. The kinds of reading that kids have to do in science may be special in some respects. Okay, in other words, it may require some special skills to understand, for instance, how scientific arguments are framed, how support for scientific arguments are made given data and so on, how reports are crafted based on scientific inquiry, how field work is conducted and reported using literacy tools, reading and writing and so on. And so the teacher of science could be involved in helping to develop these specialized reading and writing and communication skills that are very germane to learning the specific content in science class. Likewise, in history class, right? The history teacher also is dealing with content in arguments, in support and so on for assertions, for looking and comparing the validity of points of view, the validity of sources, and so on. And it would, I think, take some special kinds of literacy processes and scaffolding to make sure that the students in those social studies or history classes learn how to approach text, both in terms of reading it and trying to interpret it and trying to weigh arguments, and then how they craft text in terms of developing their own assertions and putting support behind that. So when I talk about content literacy, when I talk about disciplinary literacy, I'm referring to those specialized literacy needs that students might have in these particular subject areas that teachers could be supporting through systematic interactions and strategies. And I say this because often students will develop a general ability to read in primary school, but when they start dealing with these very technical topics and texts in secondary school, they may struggle. And so it's incumbent upon teachers to make sure that of those subject areas to provide that kind of scaffolding and support.
Yeah, I'm not sure how this is in America, but I think some teachers might say, well, I'm not a language teacher,
Yeah.
I'm a math teacher or a science teacher. So how would you respond to those teachers?
Yeah, and that's the typical response I've been getting for almost 40 years in the United States. I've been doing years and years of professional development there. Well, I can tell you a couple things from experience that might be helpful. So, do you remember Hurricane Katrina and how catastrophic that was in the United States, particularly in Louisiana, and especially in New Orleans, you know, the main city of that state? Right after Katrina, the government, U.S. government, poured a great deal of money into that state to try to rebuild it, both in terms of its infrastructure but also in other areas. And one of the areas where there was a big influx of funds was to renovate and revamp their education system. I was invited to be a consultant on that redevelopment process in Louisiana. And I was the literacy consultant in their complete redrafting of their curriculum. Now what they wanted is they wanted a curriculum that integrated literacy processes and strategies throughout the curriculum, from kindergarten through advanced upper secondary. And so I worked with a large team of teachers who were especially selected to be curriculum writers because of their skills and their knowledge and so on, and their ratings as very quality teachers. And we worked together to develop this curriculum. And what I had to do with these teachers, similar to this question you raised, is I had to first convince them that this was a worthwhile effort, that they should actually incorporate these literacy processes and strategies into a curriculum that was, at least beforehand, pretty much based on just imparting information. So for instance, in a science curriculum or in a math curriculum, it was pretty much just talking about the content that students needed to learn. And here's the content, here are a few general suggestions, and that was pretty much it. Okay, here are the standards that needed to be met. And we had to look back at that material and find ways of making sure we foregrounded the communication processes that are inherent in all content areas. So for instance, to be a good scientist, you have to be able to gain new knowledge through reading and listening, and you have to be able to demonstrate your new knowledge through writing and speaking. So that notion, that model applies virtually to any content area, right? Any subject or discipline. So that took some work. One of the ways I did this was through a series of studies that I did in the state. And we would do studies that went something like this. We would look at the state assessment results in reading. Every state in the United States, by the way, we have over 50 states, if you take Puerto Rico and a few others into account, has what we call high stakes assessments, so that all students, in some cases starting as early as kindergarten, but in most cases third grade and beyond, have to take annual assessments in typical reading, writing, and even subject areas. So we would look at the state results for students in a school on reading, and then we would correlate those results with performance in the subject areas. Okay? And we were demonstrating every single time that the better readers were the better performers in all the subjects. Okay? So for instance, the student who had real high reading scores on the assessment was also one of the better students with the highest marks in science, the highest marks in history, the highest marks in maths, and so on, right? So we would put this data in front of teachers, and we would dissect it and discuss it and so on. And for many, this was a real epiphany, right? Because for the first time, they were seeing this concrete evidence that, my gosh, if I just make sure I help support and raise the reading level of my students, I'm likely to get a payoff even in my own class, right? Because I'll have better students. Mm-hmm. So that was one way we were able to work to try to convince teachers that this was a worthwhile effort. And in the end, it had a pretty strong impact. But this question about who is responsible for teaching or raising the literacy abilities of students is maybe not strictly the question. The question is, what kind of benefit can I get if I scaffold the communication processes that are inherent in learning and communicating that knowledge in my discipline? And I think if you approach teachers that way, you're much more likely to get, as we might say, buy-in and support from them.
Yeah, that's true. And you have written a book on content literacy. So I was thinking, what role can content area or disciplinary literacy play in supporting the language development and reading and writing abilities of students?
Yeah, and that's a real important question, isn't it? Because going back to the points I've been making, that all teachers should be responsible and not necessarily the special teachers, for students who might struggle. This is a real critical question, and again, one that all teachers should be involved in contributing to. So one way we might think about making learning in these subject areas or disciplines more engaging, and this issue of engagement is a real critical one. When I was talking earlier about the kind of diagnosis we need to do, remember I said not only cognitively, but we need to look at the affective dimensions of students and even the sociological dimensions. So when we think in terms of engagement, we think in terms of how interested are these kids in wanting to learn this content? How can we connect this content to their own lives somehow? How can they see that learning this material will give them some tools to perform better in society? Okay, maybe find a job that matches their interests. They can make better decisions about their families and their finances and their local politics. Something that at least gives them a link to real life. And I think the power of these content and disciplinary literacy approaches is that we can potentially do that, because the goal in many cases with the curriculum for a disciplinary literacy approach is to connect to real world learning, is to give students real world problems to solve. And we can turn that back to what's happening in your own life. So let's again use an example of something in science. Imagine a student is living in an impoverished neighborhood, and there's a garbage in the streets, that kind of thing, where they're living with this day in and day out. Lead paint in their apartments, which is poisonous to children and so on. We could relate scientific learning about chemistry, about ecology and so on, to these issues that are directly tied to the daily experiences of youth, and give them then some knowledge and tools that they might be able to take back to their communities, if not as young people, certainly as they grow older, to help them solve some of these problems, to exert pressure, for instance, on local politicians to make sure that landlords get rid of the lead paint or the asbestos that's in these apartments, to clean up the blight, the garbage and so on that may be in the community. I think that's where we're coming from with respect to these notions of how this curriculum might be able to reach kids, make them more engaged about learning, and consequently keep them on track for improving their literacy skills.
Yeah, I think that's a really important issue, to get topics where students can relate to and where they have a connection to their day-to-day practice.
Yeah.
And I think quite often at school we're on the level is too abstract, so they don't know what has this to do with me, or so.
Exactly.
I think that's the thing. So one last question, Bill, if you would have to have one wish for for literacy education all over the globe, what would that be? Or just America, if that's easier, or Europe, or...
Well, I think globally is an interesting question, because of course we worry so much about our own context, and yet in the end we're all connected. And so what is happening in sub-Saharan Africa right now, where illiteracy rates are abysmal, where young girls don't even have access to school. I mean, those are issues that we should all somehow be behind and be concerned about, because in the end they do affect us. They create political unrest, they create famines, they create wars, they create overpopulation. I mean, all of these issues are issues that we in modern and comfortable Western societies should be concerned about. So if I were to have a global wish for literacy, I would say we do everything we can to make sure girls get educated in the developing world, to make sure that families get the best kinds of literacy support possible, because we know when literacy levels rise, especially among girls and women, especially in the developing world, that families improve. Family health improves, family finances improve, family stability improves, and so on. And that creates a global society that's more genial and better for everyone.